Let's move on to the third one now. The third one is that sort of montage of guilt, victimage, and purification. To understand how this works, if we've got the idea of category stemming from the negative, and if we've got the inevitable sense of hierarchy, which forms identity, then Burke says we can begin to understand what happens. Basically, we have that identity that we recognize, that we embrace, that hierarchy of values that is ours. And from that hierarchy of values, we suddenly establish an ideal. We put together what is fundamentally and essentially our priorities, our set of values in an idealized form. This is who we ought to be. This is who we really, really want to be. We want to fulfill our hierarchy. We want to order our lives according to the identity we've found or chosen or been given. Can come, your hierarchy can come from a thousand different places, right? You may choose it. You may be given it by your community. You may find it. Perhaps it's revealed to you by God. Wherever it comes from, it becomes an identity that is an ideal. It is what you are striving for. But in the end, what you are striving for never really works out perfectly. There's always this blemish. You discover as you try to work out your ideal identity, as you try to live up to the hierarchy, the order of values that you have established, that you have recognized, that you have submitted to, as you try to do that, you inevitably discover, Burke says, some part of you, some part, somehow, somewhere, has put some kind of a blemish on our ideal, almost divine, transcendent, supernatural identity. The ideal identity has been stained. There's a blemish on it. Now, since this is our ideal, since this is the way we are ordering our lives and the way we wish to order our lives, since this is what guides us in all things, having that blemish is unacceptable. We have to do something to rid our hierarchy, our ordered, our ideal identity. We have to rid it of this blemish. And how do we do that? Well, Burke says the first step is to acknowledge that the blemish is there. Mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. This is my fault. It's my fault. There's some kind of way of dealing with this. But the first step is to say, there's been a failure. You have to acknowledge that the blemish, the sin, is there. That's your first step. Because you can never repair any blemish. You can never remove any sin. You can never take away any failing until you look it squarely in the eye and say, this is a failure. This is a failure, and it must be dealt with. Okay, once you then have acknowledged the failure, once you acknowledge your guilt, that there is a problem here, well, the next step is victimage. Victimage is a complicated idea. This sin, this stain, this blemish, this failing is going to require a sacrifice. Now, why is it going to require sacrifice? Well, it's going to require sacrifice because that's the only thing that will fix it. Look, if you could fix it and it would be easy to fix, if it didn't cost too much to fix it, then it's not really a big blemish. It's maybe a misstep or an error in judgment. It's something small. And those small things, you just say, oh, well, that's a small error. It's easily dealt with. It's not that huge a problem. When you see this, though, when you see a serious blemish, when there is something that requires guilt, that you have to acknowledge the system itself has been besmirched, sinned, broken, then that's going to require some heavy lifting. In other words, it's going to require work. And that's what we mean by sacrifice. Sacrifice is hard work. And so somehow we're going to have to work really hard to get this blemish out of here and restore the purity, the order of our ideal identity, of our hierarchy of values. So this sacrifice is going to be costly. And Burke says there are a couple of ways to do it. All right, here's the first way you can engage in sacrifice. The first sort of sacrifice, Burke says, is mortification. Mortification is where you say, this blemish is my fault. I have found the source of the sin, and it's me. It's inside me. Somewhere inside me is a failing, a problem, a sin, a brokenness that does not allow me to live up to the ideal that I know I want to. That's a problem. I am the source of the blemish. And Burke says mortification is one kind of sacrifice where you say, yes, it's me, I am the source. And that means you have to do things. You have to discipline yourself. You have to punish yourself. You have to improve yourself. Something has to be done to you in order to bring that direction, that healing from you to this space. Since you're the one who's broken, there's a part of you that has to be killed, that has to be sacrificed because it's not living up to the ideal. So you gotta undo you. You're the problem. That's a sacrifice. And it's going to be costly, and it's going to be hard. And in religious systems, it involves, fasting and prayer and, intense sacrifice of material goods or avoiding material goods for seasons and periods and so forth. So all of that is built into certain kinds of ritualized behavior in religion. We see this very frequently in religion. We see clearly an idealized identity that is out there, a hierarchy. We see clearly a recognition that something is wrong with the hierarchy, and we say, it's me. I'm the one who did it, and I will simply engage in these behaviors, these actions, which will help set right the blemish. So that's one kind of sacrifice. It is not, however, the only kind of sacrifice. All right? The second kind of sacrifice that Burke talks about is called scapegoating. This one we need a few minutes to unpack and understand. All right, so scapegoating works like this. Scapegoating is essentially a process where you say the other is the source of the blemish. Now, there may be some of me involved in here, but in reality, the problem is somebody else, and that somebody else has to be sacrificed. That's the nature of scapegoating. Now, the term scapegoat comes from the Jewish tradition. Long story short, in a certain particular ritual in ancient Judaism, on the day in which the people were confessing all their sins, their failings of living up to the promises, the covenant that God had given them. So they had this idealized identity. They discovered that they had failed, and they brought in, as part of the ritual, 2 goats. And they basically drew lots, okay? One goat won the lottery, and the other goat lost the lottery. In this case, you want to be the goat that lost the lottery, okay? Because the goat that lost the lottery was brought forward and was just killed. It had its throat cut, and it was sacrificed, and the blood was poured out, and the blood was sprinkled over the people, okay? Pretty clear sacrifice here. But the other goat was called the scapegoat. At least that's how the English translates the Hebrew when it comes into the 15 and 1600s into English. The scapegoat would be brought forward, And what would happen is the priest in the ritual would lay his hands on the head of the goat. And while he had his hands on the head of the goat, he would repeat the sins that the people had committed, and he would lay them on the head of the goat. So the goat becomes essentially a beast of burden. This goat is going to carry the sins of the people. And that goat, once all the sins have been confessed, the failings have been brought and placed on the head of the goat, then the goat is handed to a man who's standing nearby and is led out into the desert. And once it's led out into the desert, it's staked out there, and the man leaves. So the goat is driven out of the community and left to die in the wilderness, a slow and horrible death. In this particular picture of a scapegoat, you see all these arrows in it. That is just, it had nothing to do with the old Jewish tradition, but it's a nice visual, okay? So the scapegoat was part of that old Jewish ritual that would take the sins, the blemish, confess the sins onto the head of someone or something else, and then that someone or something else would be driven out of the community, and they would carry the sins with them. And that is what would make the hierarchy ordered again. It would bring together the community because the blemish would have been carried away by the goat. Now, Burke takes this idea of scapegoating, and he very clearly identifies that as one way human beings deal with disorder, with besmirking, with failures of the hierarchy. They put those failures onto somebody else. They name someone else as the source of our fault, our flaw, and then they drive them out of the community. That's the way it works. Now, to be fair, remember, there are conditions. We could talk about them, and we will in certain specifics. There are conditions, of course, when yeah, sure, the problem is somebody else, right? It's not always just your fault. Sometimes the problem is somebody else, and you do your best to create common ground, to find places in the hierarchy where we agree with one another, and we try to build common cause on those agreements. But sometimes the problem is elsewhere. So you got to deal with that in these political frames where you go to war. All right. So my ideal identity is something that is so horrifying to the other that they want to destroy my whole identity. Well, in a case like that, if they're coming to destroy your identity, most people would say in our priority of values, self-defense is up here. You can resist them trying to destroy your identity. If that sounds familiar, well, welcome to American politics in 2020. It sounds familiar because that's a lot of what is going on right now in our political system. We are seeing different hierarchies of values that identify us, that make us who we are. We've got two different Americas working here, and they're utterly incompatible on almost every level, according to groups that rally around one or the other. Now, whether or not that's true, we'll find out in the coming years. But here's the process for Burke. We have an order, we have an ideal, an identity that we want to belong to, and that identity is composed out of a hierarchy of values. Those hierarchy of values are compromised. We acknowledge the compromise because that's the only way you can repair the order in the world. But then it is, if it's a serious order, if it's something worthy of guilt, then that's going to require sacrifice. Sacrifice is going to come in one of two ways. You're going to say, I'm not living up to the ideal, it's me. I'm going to work hard, and we're going to take the following actions, and we're going to rebuild, and we're going to cleanse, and we're going to purify our order, our hierarchy, and we're going to make it better. We're going to return to the ideal. Or you can engage in scapegoating. You can say, our ideal, beautiful order and hierarchy, it has been ruined by them. They're the ones who did it. Drive them out. Cast them forth from the community. And one way or the other, that casting forth leads to a different experience. Sacrifice restores the idealized order. Whether it's mortification or whether it's scapegoating, there is a power in the sacrifice that brings to that failing a reordering. It purifies. It cleanses the order. It makes the order better. It returns it to the ideal. The blemish fades. All right, I hope you can see there are a lot of ways this process of victimage over here can go horribly, horribly wrong, right? It's not hard to imagine it in lots of ways being really problematic. On the other hand, it is possible to discover that, here's a problem, and it's other people's fault, and when we talk, when we converse, when we engage in discourse, the scapegoating can turn into dialogue that brings us both to a revision, a sort of restructuring of our ideals, so that we both see a different world. So if I'm your scapegoat and you're my scapegoat, we can kill each other. That's one way we could solve this. But we can also discourse, and discourse might lead to deeper understanding on both our parts. So that's what you're up against, Burke says. But of course, this can go horribly, horribly, horribly wrong when you start blaming other people, often without very good reason, and you say they can't be here. They can't belong to the infinite, eternal, idealized reality that we're all building over here. They will always be a blemish on our perfect order. Then those people are in a lot of danger. They're in a lot of peril. That's something Burke wants to call your attention to as well. Now, in closing this section, I want to point out to you, and I think it's not hard to see, this step 3, in fact, the entire cascade here from the negative to hierarchy to this third point of guilt, victimage, and purification, this is essentially a fundamentally Christian drama. All right? Burke, remember, is studying drama. That's what he's captured by. And he sees these fundamental patterns in dramas. They keep being repeated. And when Burke explores this process of guilt, victimage, and purification, what he sees here, particularly when he turns his attention to Christianity, Burke thinks this is it. This is the ultimate story. It contains every other narrative. This is the high, perfect story. In other words, if you want to think about an idealized sense of drama, it is, Burke thinks, the Christian story. The Christian story, you can see, easily begins here in this perfect idealized world, but then there is a failing in this idealized world, right? That failing is the sin that separates us from, in our ideal world, it separates us from God. And once we are separated, once that blemish is present, we suffer guilt. And of course, guilt leads to sacrifice, victimage. We keep trying to fix it, and we do things. We try to restore the right order, the right relationship to the divine. That's what we are working for. Until eventually, of course, we keep trying and we can't do it. And eventually God steps in and becomes himself the perfect sacrifice to restore the order. And order is restored. Now, everything about this, it contains the great quest story. All right, it contains that story of loss, followed by self-discovery, followed by restoration. It contains the story, the great myth of the dying God. All right, the pagan myths are filled with the idea of the dying God. It retells that story. If you remember J.R.R. Tolkien, Tolkien was the person who convinces C.S. Lewis to become a Christian, and Tolkien does it by basically saying to Lewis, look, this great mythology of the dying God, you love that. Every time you find it in Nordic myth, every time you find it in Greek myth, every time you find it in Hindu myth, you love it in the great mythologies of the world. Well, that's all Christianity is. Christianity is the story of the dying God, with the single exception of course, Tolkien would say, with the single exception of the fact that this one happened. It actually took place. So it's an historic event. So I don't know why you hate Christianity so much. You should love Christianity. It's all the great myths with the added bonus of having actually taken place. That was Tolkien's argument that brought Lewis to convert to Christianity. So arguably, Burke says there isn't a better story. Now, hold in mind, Burke is not himself a Christian. He never moved an inch in any religious direction toward Christianity, but he loves everything about Christianity except Jesus and God. Okay, that's what it boils down to. He finds in Christianity what he understands to be the ultimate Platonic telling of the story, the dramas. And when he sees that, he sees those dramas playing out in a way that fulfills the whole transcendent scope of language. This is what explains language, Burke says. This kind of narrative, this ultimate story, is what explains how language transcends nature, and that explains why language is so frighteningly powerful. Language is part of the blemish, but also the thing that establishes the ideal order, because language, put to the right use, can bring blame and horrible things to other human beings. Remember, Burke is unpacking this entire process in the aftermath of World War II. This idea of scapegoating, he's thinking here very clearly of the Nazis scapegoating, particularly the Jews. They scapegoated a lot of other people as well, but the Jews especially got their attention, and they were blamed for the blemishes in society. This is the ultimate story, and it's the ultimate explication of logology. It's the ultimate explication of how language actually works. So, that's going to bring us to step 2, and we're going to talk about the Pentad as a method, as a way of doing criticism in a little bit more depth.